Hello, and welcome to the Evelyn Y. Davis Studios at the National Press Foundation. Today, we're helping journalists find resources to measure poverty and inequality in their communities. I'm Sandy Johnson, President Emeritus of the National Press Foundation. Before we start, I'd like to mention that reporters who participate in this webinar and one more poverty-related NPF training are eligible for NPF's Poverty and Inequality Reporting Awards. You can apply after November 1st. Right now, we're helping journalists understand income inequality and ways to measure it. With us today are Lowell Ricketts, data scientist at the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis, Kiyadh Burt, senior policy analyst at the Hope Policy Institute, and Paul Overberg, data reporter at the Wall Street Journal. Make sure you stay tuned for Paul's data tutorial during the last 15 minutes of this briefing. So welcome. And let's kick off the discussion with a definition of persistent poverty. Kiyadh?
All right. Well, first, good afternoon, everybody. Hope everybody's doing well. And as Sandy just mentioned, I'm going to start with the definition of persistent poverty. You all may have heard of it. Many of you may not. So let's go ahead and get started. So persistent poverty is measured as any county that has a poverty rate of at least 20% for the past 30 years, which is based on the decennial census starting in 1980, 1990, and 2000. And for more contemporary calculations of persistent poverty, we will use the American Community Survey 5-year estimates for that poverty rate. Now, there are 476 persistent poverty counties in the United States and its territories. Now, and persistent poverty counties are important to study and understand because this framing of poverty is essentially a framing of generational poverty, in that the outcomes are coming across decades of time. So despite decades of technological advancements and economic developments, many households and communities that are in persistent poverty counties are unlikely to have experienced those benefits. It's the first slide, Jeff. Yeah, they experience a different reality. And the data that I'm going to provide now is going to be pre-COVID. And again, we're looking at persistent poverty counties or persistent poverty communities. Now, 86% of persistent poverty counties have unemployment rates in excess of the national average. 75% of the counties in the country that have household unbanked and underbanked rates at 1.5 times greater than the national average are persistent poverty counties. And lastly, 81% of persistent poverty counties are in the bottom quartile of counties in terms of health outcomes. So said simply, communities that are located in persistent poverty counties are dealing with a different landscape of challenges in accessing adequate health, adequate employment, and adequate access to banking and financing. Now, let's also consider that 8 out of 10 persistent poverty counties are rural, and the majority of people living in persistent poverty counties, the majority being 60% of people living in persistent poverty counties, are people of color. In fact, 4 out of 10 persistent poverty counties are majority people of color counties, as shown by this map here. So then, persistent poverty is also a measure of racial and geographic inequity, which is a result of decades of policies that have served to financially weaken rural communities and communities of color. Now, I want to quickly say before we move to the next slide that if you were to look at the green counties on this map, you'll see that it actually correlates with high concentrations of people of color or rural communities. If I had a laser pointer, I'd show you how, if you look at the southeastern region of the United States, that those green counties, right, and those counties that are the slightly darker shade of green, actually mirror the Black Belt, where we have large, high concentrations of Black individuals in the United States. And if you will look at the southwestern and southern border, you see that those persistent poverty counties track high areas of brown people of color, people of Hispanic or Latino descent. And if you were to look in the northeastern, the slight northeastern region, this is West Virginia, northern East Tennessee, you see there's a high concentration of persistent poverty county along the Appalachian Mountain Range. So we see, just by visually looking at this map, that persistent poverty county is effectively another measure of looking at racial, and this does include poor whites, and geographic inequities. All right, next slide, Jeff. All right, so my job as an analyst, and by extension, your job as a journalist, is to understand the impact of persistent poverty. Now, my work centers on the Deep South. It's a geographic region which includes Alabama, Arkansas, Louisiana, Mississippi, and Tennessee. And in our region, we represent 1/3 of persistent poverty counties in the country. And we also know that persistent poverty is correlated with other variables of opportunity. We see here we have unemployment, unbanked, county health rankings, education, and race, and then we have high cost mortgage lending. But just a few other points here about the relationship between persistent poverty, geography, and other variables of interest is that in the Deep South, the highest rates of unemployment are often in places of persistent poverty. The highest rates of unbanked and underbanked households are in communities of persistent poverty. And access to quality education and health outcomes are among the lowest in persistent poverty counties. Now, these maps show a strong correlation or relationship between the lack of mobility, the ability of a household to reach financial stability, and low access to financial services, but they do not establish a causal relationship, right? But nonetheless, these correlations reveal large gaps in access to capital, right? And access to wealth building strategies between counties that are persistent poverty and counties that are not. Now, again, we want to give you all the tools to access this data and weaponize this in your writing and investigation. Now, data on persistent poverty can be found, at least the data that I've used to populate these maps can be found at the CDFI Fund's website. And Jeff does have the spreadsheet by which this data was populated. But more generally, data on persistent poverty counties can be found at the USDA's website. They were the originator of the definition. You can go and find the definition of persistent poverty county at their website. So that link will be provided during this panel and also at the end of the session. So I'll stop there and kick it off to Lowell if he has any other contributions on defining poverty.
Thank you, Kiyadh. That was incredibly fascinating to look at some of these maps. And I think there's going to be a lot of connections between what I'm going to be talking about and what you just covered there. Some of this importance of place, importance of race, and some of the interconnections between both income and wealth. I'm going to venture to give a little bit of a different perspective on poverty here. So I work at the Institute for Economic Equity. This is an institute that was launched earlier this year. And we're really focused on promoting an economy in which all thrive. And we've just touched on some of the dimensions in the US, which are predictive of which families are struggling to achieve financial outcomes and which families are thriving. Of those, race and ethnicities proven to be important. Place has proven right there in the slides to be a powerful factor, as well as gender and some other demographic factors in the US. So what do we study? We often in our work study household balance sheets, what families own, what they owe, and of course what they earn, which we were just talking about. And I think the balance sheet perspective is important. Michael Sheridan back in 1991 kind of put forward this idea that a household's well-being is derived not solely from income, but also the building of assets and savings. And that this accumulated wealth has two dimensions that are important to think about. It helps families be resilient in the short term, and it also provides for mobility in the long term, right? So we've seen shocks in the pandemic, the likes of job loss on historic proportions. And for those families that have savings, especially liquid assets, checking and savings accounts, exactly what Kiyadh was talking about when it comes to underbanked and unbanked households. Those families that have access to meaningful amounts of liquid assets are less likely to suffer some of the worst forms of financial instability, whether it's delinquency on rent and potential eviction, or food insecurity, not being able to provide sufficient nutrition for both the adults in the household and children if available. So time and time again, this asset perspective is uniquely important above and beyond what income says. But unfortunately, it's very hard to measure assets, right? Here's the kicker, is income. We get a lot of great administrative records to understand through the census and through the IRS exactly what the earnings of households are. And we're getting even better data on that front, starting to understand income volatility for many households. But asset data is hard to come by. One incredibly important resource in this work is called the Survey of Consumer Finances. It's put together by the Federal Reserve Board of Governors. The modern equivalent goes back to 1989. And it goes every 3 years to the present of 2019. And it's a powerful survey. It not only is useful in the sense that it captures the wealth holdings of very wealthy families in the US, giving you a more accurate picture of wealth inequality and the wealth distribution, but it also is incredibly important for understanding things like the racial wealth gap and how persistent it is despite rising educational attainment, political representation, and even some convergence of earnings between white and Black and Hispanic families, but we still see the racial wealth gap persistent in a pretty staggering way. The average or the typical Black family has about 12 cents to the typical white family. So when you look at inequality and measures of that, assets show a much wider gulf by race and ethnicity in the US. I'm going to give you a couple definitions of asset poverty. One popularly used one is whether families have sufficient net worth to rely upon, say if they suffered a job loss, to sustain their livelihood above a poverty level for at least 3 months. That's a common definition put out by Haveman and Wolf. I'll borrow from the sister survey, another survey the Federal Reserve Board of Governors puts out called the Survey of Household Economics and Decision Making, SHED for short. We love acronyms at the Federal Reserve. And the SHED survey is important. It asks this quintessential question. I'm sure many of you have come across this. What would you do if you had to cope with an unexpected $400 expense, right? A relatively small expenditure. Anyone who's had a sudden car repair come up, that's kind of what we're talking about here in the ballpark. And at the end of 2020, 36% of adults would cope with that expense by selling something or borrowing money. And I think this statistic is really powerful because it captures the insufficiency of liquid asset holdings across a third of American households. And that's the best it's been since the survey was asking this question starting in 2013. It was closer to 50% at the beginning, and it's whittled down during the recovery, and it's held strong. It actually dipped down in 2020. If you're curious about some of the pandemic support extended to families, it shows up in the statistic, but a lot of that support seems to have faded. We're back to where we were in 2019. So good news is we're not further from where we have been. So let me stop there and I'll kick it back to Sandy. And hopefully that gives you a little sense of some of the resources that are out there and this concept of asset poverty.
Lowell, one quick follow-up on the SHED survey do reporters have the ability to delve down into that data on a state, regional, or county level? What kind of granularity is there?
Unfortunately, both of these surveys are primarily available at the national level. That's one of the challenges working with it. So one avenue that reporters could use is to capture some of the demographic, the strong associations with various outcomes, whether it be wealth or financial instability, and suggest that the local demographics would pick up a similar relationship. We've done that in some of our work here in St. Louis. We think that the racial wealth gap at the national level is relevant for our communities here within St. Louis and more broadly, the 8th Federal Reserve District.
All right, thank you. Let's dig a little deeper into unemployment and poverty rates. Kiyadh, why don't you go ahead and start with that?
Yeah, sure thing, Sandy. As I mentioned earlier, 86% of persistent poverty counties have unemployment rates in excess of the national average. And data on unemployment can be found at the Bureau of Labor Statistics. Now, the Bureau of Labor Statistics reports unemployment rates each quarter for each state and for the overall national rate. Now, with the onset of COVID, unemployment rates have increased as a result of a number of factors. But what's of interest to the community that we serve are the implications of high unemployment, and more focused is its impact on liquid asset poverty, in which Lowell just underscored. Now, I'm gonna just kind of offer a similar definition just so we have a working understanding. Liquid asset poverty measures the liquid savings households hold to cover basic expenses for 3 months if they experience a sudden job loss or economic downturn, such as a medical emergency, or as is the case now, COVID-19 with business shutters. Now, you can find data on liquid asset poverty at the Prosperity Now scorecard. Now, Jeff, if you can pull that link up and I can walk the journalists through how to access this data. But as he's doing that, if he has capacity, let me kind of show you one powerful statistic. So Prosperity Now can populate the data, liquid asset poverty, by state, county, and also by race. Nationally, we know that 58% of Black households are liquid asset poor, as compared to only 29% of white households that are liquid asset poor. So simply put, Black households are more financially vulnerable as unemployment rates increase. Now, so I want to quickly give you all that. Now, you see we're looking at Prosperity Now scorecard. Jeff, if you click on Explore Date by Issue Area, we're going to look at financial assets and income, and we're going to look toward the bottom half of the screen, and we're going to click on liquid asset poverty rate. Again, this is a data tool to help you investigate the impact of certain variables for your particular state or region. Now, you see here, we have state data, liquid asset poverty rate. We have the United States at the top, and then we have the rest of the states right below that. And you see that the national rate of liquid asset poor, these are households that do not have enough liquid assets, cash, savings, or checking account to subsist economic downturn for the next 3 months. You see that the number should be around 36.9%. Now, Jeff, if you scroll up just a little bit, I want you to click on a tab that says show by race or data by race. You see that? Data by race. Okay. So not only are you able to get the data at the state level, you're able to get the data at a state by race level. And the statistics I just gave you, I literally pulled from this particular webpage. And you see at the United States level, we see that for white households, the liquid asset poverty rate should be 29%, and the liquid asset poverty rate for Black households should be 58%. So here's a way in which you can use a tool to give you better leverage and understanding what's happening in your state and in your region. So I'll stop there, Sandy, and kick it back to you or to Lowell. Just want to be sure they have access to that data tool.
Yes, Lowell, thank you very much for answering that question. Just to the people who have registered and are participating in the webinar, you can ask your questions in the chat, and I will either toss the question to the participants, or in Lowell's case, he went ahead and answered it in the chat. So Lowell, did you have anything further to add on unemployment and its impact on poverty?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the missions, or one of the areas of focus of our new institute here at the St. Louis Fed, is we're really digging into labor market dynamics, right? And we're asking questions and trying to focus on the outcomes for vulnerable groups. So what do we mean by vulnerable groups? Well, these are groups, demographically speaking, and otherwise, that are more sensitive to economic downturns and shocks, such as the COVID-19 pandemic. So we've just put out a recent blog article that is going to be the kickoff of a series of posts in which we track these outcomes for teenagers, those with no more than a high school diploma, Black men and women, Latino men and women, as well as people with a disability. And what we find in these outcomes, these are groups that had persistent gaps relative to, say, white, college-educated households. They've had persistent gaps in many labor market measures, whether it be unemployment, or the employment to population ratio or labor force participation rate, all statistics available from the Bureau of Labor Statistics and in FRED, a great resource that the St. Louis Fed provides. But what we want to kind of isolate here is that there's two ways to think about getting back to where we were, right? One is this responsive concept of equity, in which you provide resources to individuals and communities to erase the gaps in, say, employment that formed because of the COVID-19 pandemic. There's another way to think about this. We can think about structural equity. What if you were able to provide the resources needed for individuals and communities to erase the gaps that existed well before the COVID-19 pandemic that have roots in the past? And so that's what we're really trying to advance here, is not just a responsive equity, but to go further. I think there was a lot of calls for this type of structural change, especially after the death of George Floyd and others. So this is something that our institute is going to be tracking carefully. And just thinking about unemployment and its links to poverty, well, Kiyadh just showed you the stark levels of asset inequality in the US and the low margins that families have available. You can think of these liquid assets as a form of private insurance for whatever might come, whether it be a medical injury or sickness with COVID-19, for example. This is what will really let families, will buoy them in times of crisis above and beyond assistance channels that sometimes are very slow. As we know well with the unemployment insurance systems of many states that struggled with the historic load that was put upon them at the start of the pandemic. And so that's where these assets become incredibly important during unemployment spells to keep families afloat before assistance arrives. And so I'll kick it back to you, Kiyadh and Sandy.
So banking or lack thereof is also a way to measure poverty and inequality. Kiyadh, what data can you point reporters to on banking?
Yeah, I've already mentioned a lot of data between the correlation between persistent poverty counties and unbanked and underbanked status. But the major data resource is going to be the FDIC. They actually have a website. It's titled FDIC Inclusion Resource or something along those lines. And again, I could share that as well. But effectively, we're looking at rates of households that have access to traditional financial services like checking or savings account. And in some cases, that's underbanked. So the definition of underbanked household is a household that has at least a checking or savings account with a mainstream financial institution, which would be a bank or a credit union. And unbanked is exactly what it implies. They have neither a checking or a savings account or credit product with a mainstream financial institution. Now, what we should also be thinking about is what is the impact of having limited service or relationship with a financial institution or no relationship with a financial institution. Simply what we have, at least in the American system, is a two-tiered financial services system in which we see households that do not have adequate access to financial services or no relationship with the financial institution using predatory lenders, or in the most safe sense, alternative financial services to get the needs that they get the services that they need. Now, some examples of alternative financial services could be fintech lenders, predatory lenders such as payday lenders and title card lenders, and check cash advances. Now, the issue that arises in using these alternative institutions of financial services is that they typically have a predatory model of service delivery in which they provide higher interest rates, and they create a model by which you get caught in a debt trap. Now, the stickiest data point I could give you is looking at the state of Mississippi. $500 million is extracted out of Mississippi households every year to alternative financial service providers. $500 million extracted. Alternatively, if they were able to get access to a mainstream financial institution, that's money that they could be using to build wealth. Again, think about the liquid asset poverty number. That's money that they could be using as a financial cushion to survive, to better prepare and mitigate the impacts of the economic downturns of COVID-19. So that's just a quick definition of unbanked and underbanked, quick impact of what happens when families don't have access to these traditional financial services, and where you can go to get the base data on unbanked and underbanked rates. And I want to also quickly add that I work at a community development financial institution, Hope Credit Union, Hope Enterprise Corporation, Hope Policy Institute, like three legs of one stool whose focus is increased financial inclusion among low-income rural families in the Deep South. Again, Alabama, Arkansas, Louisiana, Mississippi, and Tennessee. The idea that unbanked and underbanked rates lead to this two-tiered financial services system is something that we actively fight against. We're fighting to increase financial inclusion. And I'm getting a bit ahead of myself here, but toward the end of the call, we're going to talk about how CDFIs, these are community development financial institutions, serve to mitigate the impact of that two-tier financial system. We are fighting to increase access to affordable financial services and products, okay? Because we know that if you don't have access to affordable financial services and products, the likelihood of you becoming a homeowner decrease, okay? The likelihood of you becoming financially stable decrease, and the likelihood of you becoming, or rather reaching your financial goal decreases, because your money that you made and money that you will make is already being extracted by these institutions that are charging high interest rates and they're not assessing your ability to repay. So I just want to quickly say that FDIC is going to be your primary data point.
Yeah, we could do a whole briefing on predatory lending for sure.
For sure.
Lowell, can you describe for us the Bank On initiative?
Yeah, it's a perfect segue from the great data points that Kiyadh mentioned. I think the Bank On initiative cites many of the same FDIC stats. And in particular, one that jumped out at me was when we're looking at unbanked and underbanked households, there's again this split between Black and Hispanic households. 48% of Black households, 42% of Hispanic households are unbanked and underbanked. This is compared to less than 14% of white households. And this is a critically important issue when we think about the stimulus payments that went out as a support channel during the pandemic, right? We know that there are greater delays, especially with the Postal Service operational capacity during the pandemic. There are greater delays for families that did not have direct deposit into one of these accounts. So this is a feature, a structural feature inhibiting for these Black and Hispanic families the speed of assistance during the pandemic. I just wanted to highlight that point. So what is Bank On? Bank On was an effort to provide products that wouldn't be extractive, that don't have fee structures such as overdraft fees, and also will be providing common services that may be going to these predatory lenders, these alternative financial services at no cost or little cost to participants. So this was an industry initiative. There's been a lot of support behind it. You can get data on these Bank On accounts and some of the industry standards that they've established for accounts to be considered part of Bank On. And the CFE fund, along with the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis, has created a national data hub. And they're working with the 2020 data and Bank On right now, and they'll soon be issuing a report. So that's something to keep an eye on. And I can drop in the chat the link to that national data hub. And this is an important effort, as Kiyadh said, to make sure resources are not being extracted from communities that have the least resources at their disposal.
Gentlemen, we've got about 15 minutes left before we segue to Paul's presentation. So I'm going to skip ahead to small business, which of course are the beating heart of communities. They've been disproportionately hurt by the Great Recession and now COVID. So Kiyadh, what happens when mom and pop businesses downsize or close entirely?
Well, for many communities, particularly communities of color, what this means is they're losing the opportunity to decrease that racial wealth gap. We know that, generally speaking, the racial wealth gap between white and Black families is about 10-1. But when we look at Black business owners and white business owners, it's something closer to 3-1. And so when we see the closure of these mom and pop stores, this Front Street, if you will, Main Street, if you will, we're losing their ability to sustain communities and sustain financial stability and wealth generation. Now, what I would like to raise is that for many small businesses at the onset of COVID, we did see a lot of challenges in accessing federal and state relief. And so again, in thinking about how to further investigate the impacts of COVID and how to figure out and understand what's the best way forward, I think that another place to look at, again, is going to be looking at community development financial institutions. Now, I've provided a link to a list of over 1,200 CDFIs across the country that have served in the small business sector as an opportunity to increase access to critical capital for these small businesses, typically who are underserved populations, which means people of color, rural communities, and also in some cases, communities that are recovering from financial calamity, natural calamities such as Hurricane Katrina, or even in 2008, 2010, the Great Recession. Here's an interesting fact about CDFIs, at least in Mississippi and Louisiana. For PPP loans that were under $150,000, CDFIs processed 7 times more PPP loans than the largest banks in that region. So that's just a data point to say that CDFIs are increasing access to critical capital. And at the same time, CDFIs are working in a system that doesn't necessarily benefit small businesses of color. An example at the state level is that Tennessee Small Business Relief Program, over 90% of those funds went to white-owned businesses. Over 90% went to white-owned businesses due to a racially discriminatory funding formula. Furthermore, Jeff, if you can pull up this slide that shows bar chart of non-employers in the Deep South. Furthermore, when we think about increasing access to, again, federal relief programs for small businesses, we know that sole proprietors, which are a form of non-employers, struggle to access the Paycheck Protection Program during the first round. Now, a non-employer is simply a business that doesn't record any employees. But for the first round of the Paycheck Protection Program, Congress failed to provide guidance in a timely fashion to this specific set of business type. And what effectively happened is that hundreds of billions of dollars bypass communities of color as they awaited guidance. And how do we know that? Well, we know that 96 of Black and Latino-owned businesses in the Deep South, Alabama, Arkansas, Louisiana, Mississippi, and Tennessee, are non-employers, again, which is a broader definition of sole proprietors. And that's just in the Deep South. If we think about national rates of non-employer business types, we know that about 90% of Latino-owned businesses are non-employers, and 97% of Black-owned businesses are non-employers. Okay, so to think about the discriminatory funding or funding formula for PPP, that is, there are racial implications to the lack of guidance that was provided. And the data on non-employer, what we call non-employer statistics, can be found the Census, the annual business survey program, which is a part of the government's effort to collect data on small businesses. So that's kind of like the gist of information on small business. They serve a critical role in substantiating our economy. And at the same time, we need to be mindful of the ways in which we incorporate that particular business type into our recovery efforts and programs.
And Lowell, can you speak to spending at the bottom of the curve?
Yeah, absolutely. I want to highlight a good resource. The Bureau of Labor Statistics publishes the Consumer Expenditure Survey. This is something that you can break out by income quintiles. And I think what you see there is, of course, not too surprising. These housing, food, energy comprise of a large share of overall spending of these households. These households are often very, very much constrained. They are trying to manage scarcity. They're doing it as best as anyone could. but there's just a lot of capacity constraints in the budget, and you can see that in some of the data. Now, I know a lot of you are following what is the rising costs of food and energy and certainly housing. We're seeing rents go up. They were somewhat tame for a while, but now we're really seeing upward pressure on rents, and there's concern brewing with some of the moratoria on foreclosure and evictions coming to pass. This is an important area of our research as well, as we try to understand what the implications are for wage pressures, right? We've seen workers starting to see really pronounced upward wage pressure. Some industries that haven't seen wage pressures in a long time, but coupled with the inflation that we're seeing, it really begs the question of what will the gains be to workers in the U.S. And of course, all that data that we're tracking is really coming through the Bureau of Labor Statistics. The SHAD does have a little bit of information as well on other types of expenditure, such as healthcare. That's increasingly important. And what we find is, again, a strong association between income and likelihood of foregoing healthcare or burden of medical debt. And in general, this, despite 90% coverage by health insurance in 2020, we see families increasingly carrying the burden of medical debt, or a large share. For those making less than $50,000, 35% went without some form of healthcare because they couldn't afford it. So that's coming from the SHAD as well, which covers some really important statistics on spending by income.
And Lowell, the consumer expenditure survey, how granular does that go?
It's unfortunately not as granular as we would like. It's also not as frequent as we would like. But it's certainly a helpful resource to understand some of these effects. I would also point to the work, even though this data isn't available to the public, the JP Morgan Chase Institute has done a really nice job looking at how, say, medical costs impact the elderly, as well as how income volatility is increasingly a challenge. So that's coming from their proprietary data set, but I think they're finding some really powerful insights with that.
And do they do any reports that are available to the public or to reporters based on that data?
Yeah, so all the reports, fortunately, that come out of the JP Morgan Chase Institute are available to the general public. It's unfortunately, you just can't access the microdata, but they are a very prolific research shop with quite a lot of reports, especially during the pandemic, to understand the effect of, say, the stimulus payments, the child care tax credit, and watching how those balances really those assistance channels really helped the lowest income Americans, and it really boosted their income flows, but some of that drawdown has already taken place, and you can see that in some of the figures in their reports.
Mm-hmm. So Lowell mentioned the impact of healthcare costs on low-income people. Kiyadh, let's double back and talk about the crumbling health infrastructure and how that can impact the poor.
No, for sure. I do think it's important to be reminded that during this COVID era, that COVID-19 is first and foremost a public health crisis. And we know that access to hospitals is obviously one of the more critical points in mitigating the impact of COVID and its spread. But for many rural communities, this was unfortunately an expected storm. According to the Cecil Shep Center for Health Services Research, of the 160 hospital closures that happened prior to 2020, 78% were located in rural communities. Now in the Deep South, again, the region that I'm focused on, that's 27 hospitals have closed across that region. And this is happening in a region that has hospitals that are already cash strapped. This is happening in states that chose not to expand healthcare coverage, which means that we have some of the highest rates of uninsured people in the country. Now, this divestment or disinvestment contributes to the disproportionate adverse health outcomes among particularly communities of color, such as obesity, asthma, heart disease, and diabetes, which then increases their vulnerability to a respiratory disease like COVID-19. Now, based on our research, is Hope's analysis of the Kaiser Health News, which is a website that does report on the number of ICU beds at available hospitals, nearly half, it's 188 of all Deep South counties, half, 108 of 383 Deep South counties do not have an ICU bed or a hospital at all. Okay? So, and these counties are home to more than 3.6 million people. And Mississippi has the greatest number of counties without ICU beds, while Arkansas has the greatest number of counties without any hospital at all, and has the fewest number of ICU beds for its residents. And Jeff, if you can pull up the map that has the ICU beds and hospitals. So, and as he pulls it up, I just want to quickly say that without access to a hospital or ICU bed, people will need effectively to drive to the nearest county to access healthcare. But we're dealing with a rural population that may not have reliable transportation, that may not have the adequate healthcare coverage to get the needs, the right healthcare assistance that they need in time. So in thinking about what rural hospital closures or the lack of ICU bed means for a community of people amidst COVID, in many ways means battling the complications of COVID or any other health issue on your own as you find ways to drive to the nearest hospital or healthcare clinic. So it means that we need to invest more into the healthcare infrastructure as we see rural hospital closures happen even before the pandemic.
And Lowell, I think reporters will be interested in the ongoing panel study of income dynamics. Can you describe that?
Yeah, thank you, Sandy. It's a great resource. It's a survey that has been around since the 1968. It was born out of a way to assess the progress on the war on poverty. It's more than just a longitudinal survey. It's rare you can say that. It's actually a genealogical survey in that it follows the descendants of the original sample of the survey and their descendants after them. So it's very unique and it's very powerful. It can be challenging to work with, but the microdata is publicly available. They also started asking questions on wealth starting in 1984. So there's a lot of similar resources within there. It comes out more frequently, I think every 2 years now. So it's more frequent than the survey consumer finances, and you can disaggregate it by state, which is an important resource. And it speaks to questions of mobility, intergenerational mobility. It's uniquely poised to address. And there's a sociologist, Fabian Pfeffer, at the University of Michigan. He is part of the staff there that works very closely with this survey. They also do trainings at the University of Michigan to work with the survey data, which might be of interest to folks on this call. And what do they find? Well, they find in paper in 2019, they found that the wealth disadvantage of Black families is both a consequence of wealth inequality in prior generations. And we know that there's a long history of exclusion to asset building among Black families and Hispanic families as well. But there's also racial differences in the transmission of wealth positions across generations. So this is a really interesting finding and really begs the question of further research on these transmission channels. And it echoes some of what Raj Chetty and others found looking at income, in which they found that Black Americans have substantially lower rates of upward mobility and higher rates of downward mobility than whites. And this is really focused among Black men versus white men. And they pointed to employment opportunities and discrimination within both job opportunities and wages within those. So these are kind of the questions of mobility that some of these powerful resources can speak to. And it's very illuminating of, I think, the historical record as well.
Yeah, and I can vouch for what Lowell said. The researchers at the University of Michigan are happy to work with journalists on parsing those volumes and volumes of data that they've collected over the years. One quick question from a reporter before we kick this over to Paul. Do any of you know where journalists can find persistent poverty data in other countries or say Africa or Europe?
Yeah, I'm not entirely sure But what I would say a great place to start would be to look at whatever that country's or nation's equivalent to the USDA, like some type of agricultural bureaucracy, or even maybe something as similar to the Department of Treasury, which is the parent agency of the CDFI fund, in which we pull our persistent poverty definition from. That may be a great place to start. So finding the agency that does measure poverty for that country will be a great place to start.
One other area is the OECD. I don't know if persistent poverty statistics, that's a little bit more nuanced, but they do publish, I think, some poverty rates across countries using a uniform methodology across. That could be a helpful resource as well that gives you inter-country or international comparison.
Great. So thank you, Lowell and Kiyadh. You're welcome to stay on during Paul's presentation. So now we'll turn the mic over to Paul Overberg, who will walk reporters through the Census Bureau's American Community Survey, specifically for neighborhood data on income, poverty, and income disparity.
Thanks, Sandy. I'm glad to be here. And I think I can add some useful material to the great resources that both of the panelists contributed. You heard them say a couple times how much rich material is available in these national surveys and studies and the research that gets done off of these surveys in professional in papers. But journalists often want to get to the primary sources, and this data that I'm going to cover is not only locally available, not just nationally available, it's available at a lot of local levels. And it is a primary source because the Census Bureau actually gathers it itself. First of all, if you're just getting started trying to do some of this stuff, it's really important to get the terms right. There's a vocabulary in this kind of journalism like anything else. And it not only makes it more easier for you to communicate with the experts and the specialists, like the folks on this call, but any other sources, but it also means you won't make mistakes as you start to think about and read through this stuff. So income is, I'm talking mostly about what the way most of the federal agencies gather this information. Income is defined as basically forms of money, almost all of them. And the big exception when it comes to the census data I'm going to be talking about is capital gains. If you think about it, capital gains can be a very significant piece of some people's income. But when capital gains occur, is sporadic, and it's often a sort of a tax consideration rather than sort of an income. And it's also not related. It's also, so money income is typically what's defined. Earnings is a subset of that. That's what most of our income is, for most of us. Wages, salaries, tips, bonuses, commissions. You can think of it as sort of sweat of the brow kind of income. Median, you almost always want to use a median, not an average when you're looking at income data. Because incomes are so skewed, the averages are way above the halfway point in any kind of distribution of households or people. So you always want to look at median household or family incomes and things like that. Which brings me to a couple of the definitions. Household is any occupied housing unit. That's important because about more than a quarter of the households in this country are just one person. Families, which is what you might normally think of as sort of who are the people who live in housing units, that's defined as two or more related people who live together. It's a little hard to define, and so you can see that households would include people who live alone, but also roommates who live together. And they make very different kinds of income decisions in terms of splitting up who works for pay, who doesn't work for pay, how they share expenses or not. So this income, these units are defined separately, and income tables are produced separately for all households, which is everything, and then just the subset of households that are families, where people are assumed to be sharing all the income, but also the non-wage income that they get. Like, I'm going to stay home for the next year and work on a master's degree, while somebody else goes out and earns the income. And finally, per capita income is useful because it includes everybody. Basically, the Census Bureau takes the aggregate income that's reported and divides it by all the people in an area, whether they work or not, and including the people who live in group quarters, which are places like dorms and prisons and things, where income is not really a useful concept to think about at the household level. Okay, so the old standbys for any journalist who's doing local journalism on income: the American Community Survey, which Kiyadh mentioned, which has data all the way down to neighborhood levels, the Census Bureau's sort of official survey that reports income and poverty every year, once a year at the national level, and the BLS does monthly employment. Its monthly employment situation report does have some local data, and the IRS actually produces statistics of income down to the county and even zip code level. But there's a few others that are worth looking at. The current population survey does actually produce annual tabulations by occupation, earnings by occupation. And QCEW is an acronym that stands for Quarterly Census of Employment and Wages. That's a business-focused survey, but that will actually give you local data on the number of businesses, the number of employees, and their payroll, and it breaks it down by industrial categories. Not just the things you think about, like manufacturing, but all sorts of service businesses, banks, and even things you wouldn't think of as businesses, like community organizations and hospitals and things like that. LEHD PSEO is a big mouthful, but it's basically a sort of a slowly growing program. The Census Bureau is collaborating with states where they're collecting basically the information of people who graduate from state universities in those states, what college major they graduated with, and then it's tracking their earnings through a collection of earnings information that's reported through the unemployment insurance program that each state runs. So it basically links people's formal education with their earnings, and you can start to see some patterns in terms of how much money people of various educational backgrounds make. And then finally, this survey of income program participation, that is a national survey, but it also goes into great detail on who collects and for how long, the kind of safety net benefits that governments provide. So let's just focus on the American Community Survey, because that's the one that most journalists will use most of the time. The data is released every fall for the previous calendar year. Most of the time, there's a 1 year and a 5 year tranche of data that comes out in that fall. Unfortunately, this fall, there's no 2020 1-year data that cover 2020 because the data collection was so disrupted by the pandemic last year. But in December, the 5-year data will come out. That'll be data that covers 2016 to 2020. And it will actually cover everything from the national level totals all the way down to neighborhood level totals. 3 basic kind of income categories: income poverty and income disparity are in the American Community Survey. If you've ever taken it, you know it's 40 pages and includes lots of demographic details. And this is what's really important about the American Community Survey. These other surveys, either are national, they are not frequent, or they don't have the demographic details so that you can look at income by nativity or sex or occupation. And I want you to write this down. Censusreporter.org is a website that it was a website designed a few years ago by reporters for reporters. It only has the most recent 1 year and 5 year ACS data, but it's a very usable format and it's very browsable. And it's all the data down to neighborhood level for all of the ACS in the most current version. Okay, so ACS has 52 basic tables, some of them repeated separately by race on income. Here's an example of this: a basic income breakdown into 5 categories. This is just the United States totals of households by income category, but there's a separate version of this table that breaks it down for Hispanic people and Black people and American Indian people in the United States, but you can also get the same detail down to state and local levels. So you can look just at the Hispanic households in Albuquerque or something like that. Some of these income tables break out separately: earnings, Social Security income, supplemental Social Security income, wage and salary income, which is different from earnings, retirement, investment, and public assistance income. And it breaks it down in groups like this. There's also tables that just list medians and also the aggregates so that you can do your own kind of analysis. There's 26 basic poverty tables, some of them broken out separately by race. And again, this is at all levels of geography. There's tables. Here's an example of one where they've done a fair amount of math on the work as well. Looking at household income that's reported, the Census Bureau figures out, is it above or below where the current poverty level is? And then how much above or below is that? So you can see that for the United States in 2019 here, for instance, this many households were down under the poverty level, but this gives you a sense of who's near poverty, which households are in that sort of working poor category, all the way on up to households that are 5 times the poverty level in terms of their income. Again, the poverty tables are broken down by a variety of cross tabulations. And this is the actual table number for the table that I'm showing here on the screen. Finally, there's, on the subject of income inequality, there's several tables that the ACS offers. And again, all geographic levels. I'm just showing the United States here. But say shares of income. So what share of income in the United States is collected by the lowest quintile, the lowest 20% of households? Well, it's 3%. And what percent is collected by the top 5%? Almost a quarter of all the income. There's also a table that shows how, what are the cut points, sort of, in terms of dollars, what is the 20th percentile and what is the 40th percentile and the 60th and the 80th, and then the lower limit of the top 5%, which would be the 95th percentile. And then finally, there's also, they list means, the sort of what's the average income inside each of these groups. And then one more key kind of idea for income inequality is the Census Bureau computes what's called the Gini Index for all of these geographical areas that are reported in the ACS. It takes the income and it basically categorizes it in this way, this sort of Lorentzian curve. You'll see if you were to sort of imagine a small town and everybody's at the football field, the high school football field on Friday night for the game, and every household puts one person out there on the sideline. You tell them to line up and you say, you all know each other, sort yourselves out by income. So down there at the one end zone are the poor people, and down there at the other end zone are all the most affluent people in town. And you go down the sideline and you start counting the households and they tell you their income and you accumulate those. Well, if everybody had all the same incomes, that blue line that's a diagonal would be what you would see as a result. Obviously, that doesn't work in the real world, and you more typically have a curve like that orange. The Gini measures the difference between the area below that blue line and the area below the orange line, basically the deviation away from an equality scenario. And you can see, there's the table number for it. You can find the Gini ratio in the ACS for any place that it's tabulating income for. And you can see on the screen there, I've got New York City, Seattle, and Des Moines. You can see sort of typical levels. It varies from 0 to 1, so it's a nice convenient scale to sort of summarize the income disparity of an area. And Gini indexes tend to be lower in places that have big, healthy middle class. And the United States Gini is much higher than places, especially the Nordic countries or some of the European countries that have bigger, richer safety nets. And so the Gini ratio, the Gini index, gets used by the World Bank and groups like that that look at sort of the status of development in countries. It's a measure of sort of social development and stability in addition to income disparity. You can imagine if you have an extreme disparity where all the income is collected by the top 10 or 20% of the people, socially, that's not a pretty stable idea. And that's probably, you see the results sometimes when places blow up, countries have problems. It's often because there's unrest, because there's so much poverty that's persistent and income that's all flowing just to a top set of people. So with that, I think I'll just wrap up. I will, this is a short link to the slides, which are a set of Google slides, and I'm sure Sandy will make sure that they get included in the takeaways from the presentation.
Absolutely, we'll do that. So our thanks again to Paul Overberg, data reporter at the Wall Street Journal, Lowell Ricketts, data scientist at the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis, and Kiyadh Burt, senior policy analyst at the Hope Policy Institute. Resources from this webinar will be posted for your use on NPF's website at nationalpress.org, where we make good journalists better.